The federal program to rebuild after Hurricane Katrina shortchanged the poor, and new data now proves it. Joining me today are Jeff and David, both of whom contributed to this reporting. I want to first start by thanking you for being with us today and for putting this story front and center.
Thanks for having us, Lurie.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Let's talk about what was happening in the immediacy of the aftermath of the hurricane with the rebuilding efforts. There was a lot of pomp and circumstance that said, America was going to rebuild one of its great cities. And yet it has never really felt like that rebuild effort has shown up either equitably for all people or shown up even at all for some. Jeff, I'd like to start with you. What do we need to know about how the rebuild effort was structured that has sort of contributed to what this report was able to uncover?
Sure. Basically, a key fact about how the rebuilding effort was set up was the main program to get people back into their homes after Katrina was called the Road Home. This was supposed to cover the amount that was left over between what people got from insurance, from FEMA payments, from other typical sources, and what would actually take to rebuild the thousands and the tens of thousands of homes that had been destroyed. What our reporting found using data that frankly, David has been looking for 16 years while he's been covering this program. What we were able to do using this new data we were able to get was to prove that low-income homeowners in New Orleans got less of the money that they needed to get back into their homes than wealthier homeowners. Wealthier homeowners were left with about a 20% gap between what they needed and what they actually got. Low-income homeowners were left with a 30% gap. And that gets even more extreme when you consider the fact that those low-income homeowners, you're talking about a much larger percentage of their annual income. For a high-income homeowner, that was money that they could find and get and use to rebuild their homes. Low-income homeowners, you were talking in some cases about years worth of salary in order to just get the basics, a roof over their head.
And the other thing to point out, Lurie, is that gap that's still behind the gap of higher income homeowners for lower income homeowners was after they got a special extra grant available specifically for low to moderate income folks. So that extra grant that was supposed to close the gap actually never did close that gap.
David, let's stick with you for a minute. You have been covering I'm going to call them the failures after Katrina. Feel free to characterize it another way, but that's just how I've seen it. And you've been covering this for a really long time. Can you just help refresh the audience's memory as to the magnitude of what some of those failures included? The one you just mentioned, obviously a significant one, but when we're thinking about the rebuild effort, we're a decade and a half beyond Katrina at this point. Talk with us a little bit to help the audience, perhaps, because I realize some of y'all were not alive when Katrina was taking place. Some of you were not just finishing up in law school. So for those who may have forgotten really the magnitude of this effort, talk to us a little bit about what should have happened and what unfortunately did not.
Sure, Lurie. I mean, I was there on the ground. I was working at the time for the Times-Picayune newspaper. Now I work at WWL-TV, the CBS affiliate here in New Orleans. But at the time in 2006, when they got going with the recovery programs, I was working at the Times-Picayune. And this was not a problem of not having money. One of the big lessons that I immediately saw as I covered this was throwing a lot of money at the problem doesn't necessarily solve it. It's great everybody was very thankful in Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama to have received a total of $116 billion from federal taxpayers between flood insurance payouts and extra federal aid. That was great. But if you don't organize these programs and you don't devise a program that is fair and equitable for all, you're left with what we have now 15, 16 years later. And that's where the road home really came in, because that was the signature program that Louisiana put together when they received money from the Federal Housing and Urban Development Department. It was a $10 billion program, and it they tried to create it to help everyone. And to help everyone, they would have needed about 14 to 16 billion dollars. So even with that huge amount of money, there was this gap, and they had to limit the amount of money that went out the door. They put, $8 billion directly in the hands of homeowners. But if you're paying poorer homeowners less than they need to actually rebuild, you can actually put them in a worse situation at the end of the day. And that's the shame of this, is that you had people who were very well intentioned who tried to put together a program to help as many people as possible instead of a targeted program. And in so doing, they ended up hurting some of the people that they really were trying to help the most. I do not doubt the intentions of the people. There were a lot of really good intentioned people who worked really hard and who put themselves out there to answer questions constantly without any remuneration, who were taking the brunt of the criticisms. But what they ended up with was a program that was inequitable. It was not. It was. It was. It was fair in the way that it was written, but the results were inequitable, is what we found after analyzing the data.
That reminds me of the difference between equity and equality, right? Like if we all get the same thing, that's equality. But if I have a significant greater amount of need and I'm getting the exact same thing as someone who's got most of their basic needs met, that equality doesn't actually help me. It just continues to perpetuate the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And so I'm a fan of equity. I use this example when I work with educators. If we're all supposed to run a race, and we all know what time the race starts, we know how long the race is, we all have a map of the race, that's equality. But if everyone else running the race has legs and I don't, well, there's an inequity there. I may need a wheelchair, I may need crutches or some other form of support that will allow me to equitably assume my position and run that race. So I think that's something that really came through in this story, was that the inequities that were there, because the programs were not targeted at the folks who were most in need, that's where we end up seeing a lot of the shortfall in being able to support the folks who absolutely need it. Jeff, I want to come to you, because we were talking in terms of poverty, but we also know, just from being observant Americans and from your reporting, that poverty and race really have a very close connection, particularly in Louisiana. Can you talk with us a little bit about the role that poverty and that poverty-race intersection, and how it was able to really exacerbate some of the inequities that David just shared with us?
Sure. Now, as you said, in Louisiana and in New Orleans in particular, race and income are very, very closely correlated. So you typically see the wealthiest areas are almost 100% white. The poorest areas of the city are almost 100% Black. When we looked at how this affected people of different races, what you found was very similar patterns in terms of how white an area was and how much of the resources they needed they got, and how non-white an area was and how much of the resources they ended up getting. And that held true in New Orleans. Now there is another parish, a suburban parish, which is almost 100% white, but is also lower income and had lower property values, which are a key component of how this program worked. And they actually were some of the worst off in the entire state in terms of how much money they got. So this wasn't a purely racial thing, but it certainly had some very devastating impacts on a lot of Black communities and other non-white communities in New Orleans. And I think you can see the continuing effects of that in the city. This isn't just sort of historic stuff. New Orleans is still only at 80% of its pre-Katrina population. That's 100,000 people who never came back. The Black population in New Orleans used to make up more than 2/3 of the city. It's now down to about 53%.
Mm.
So you can see how this has really changed the face of the city. And I think in some of our reporting, David and Richard, uh, you know, did a really good job of explaining the differences you can really feel and see in these different neighborhoods. You go to some of the traditionally white neighborhoods of New Orleans, and not only are they doing fine now, they were doing fine relatively quickly after the storm because they got the resources they needed. There's other areas of the city, the Seventh Ward, the Lower Ninth Ward, most people are familiar with, where there's still vacant lots. There's still areas
Mm.
that never really recovered in the same kind of way.
Wow. David, one of the things that came out in the report, and I thought this was a great line. It says housing advocates say that the failures, inserting that the failures of the Road Home program are due to, quote, the original sin of the Road Home program, in that it calculated each grant based on a home's value before the hurricane or on the cost of repairs, whichever was less. And as we know on this show, there has been a lengthy history of inequitable access to capital, inequitable access to resources when it comes to Black homeowners and poor homeowners as compared to other populations. And it would seem to me that with that knowledge, we should have been able to know that this type of funding model was going to leave these sorts of gaps. If we know that homes in poor white communities and poor Black communities are going to be valued less, we also know that the rebuild costs are going to require more targeting. It would seem like at the policy level, at the decision-making level, that would have been factored into the model. If I were making the policy, let's put it that way, if I were designing the policy, I would say, hey, we have decades of experience and research that shows us how these inequities are built into the home ownership community. How about we factor that history into the way we structure this model? Did your research or your reporting uncover any discussion about that before this program was put together? And if so, what in the world happened that the program ended up being structured in this way?
Yes, actually, it did, Lurie, because I have been wondering about this for a very long time. As early as 2007, 2008, there started to be claims of discrimination built into the formula that calculated how much money each family received. And
Wow.
it wasn't really clear where it came from. And for, over a decade, I've been trying to figure this out, and I finally was able to. I went back and looked at the archives of the Louisiana Recovery Authority, which was the agency that was created specifically to help rebuild after the storm. And I traced it back to a meeting that happened in January of 2006 when the state of Louisiana was trying to get more money from the federal government. I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but basically at the outset of this, the states of Louisiana and Mississippi basically were given the same amount of money by the federal government, even though
Mm.
Louisiana had about 4 times the amount of damage from the storm.
Wow.
And so Louisiana, which was run by a Democratic governor, dealing
Yeah.
with a completely Republican Washington, a Republican controlled Congress, and a Republican White House with George W. Bush, was
Mm.
put in this position of saying, we can't even start our program until we get more money. And so when they were going back to Congress
Wow.
and working through a coordinator appointed by George W. Bush named Don Powell, they went to Powell's house in Amarillo, Texas, and basically came hat in hand and said, we need more money. You've only given us 6 billion and we need 16 billion. And when they
Mm.
compromised on 10 billion total with the additional 4 billion coming in, they said, we've got to limit this somehow. And that's where some member of the congressional delegation staff said, well, we don't want to give people more money than their home was worth to actually rebuild, even though everybody knew the cost of
Wow.
rebuilding far outpaced the value of some of these lower valued homes. And so
Right.
immediately then you're basing the program on the value of property. Value, as we all know, was, you know, driven down by all kinds of things like redlining, historical inequities in banking and lending that hurt Black homeowners. And before Katrina, there was a very large population of Black home ownership in New Orleans. So
Mm.
all of this exacerbated the problem in New Orleans. I was finally able to find out where that came from, and I was able to interview Don Powell, who's now retired. He's the former FDIC chairman, and he spoke to me and said, yeah, that's where it all kind of came from. And that was what they talked about, the original sin. Why did we do this? Well,
Wow.
it was partisan politics at the core of it that forced that onto the state of Louisiana, and they had to create that program with that limitation. There were plans to try to fill the gap between the value of the house and the actual cost to rebuild it with affordable loans, but that ended up being derailed. And like I said at the start of our conversation, there was an additional grant given to low income homeowners. But think about middle income Black homeowners, which there was
Wow.
a middle class Black residents, Black community in New Orleans, particularly strong before the storm, who didn't get the benefit of any kind of low income additional grant, but still had to deal with
Hmm.
a lower valued home compared to their counterparts in majority white communities.
You know, as I'm listening to you, several things are coming to mind. One, the failures of the post foreclosure crisis, and I'm putting "post" in air quotes. The HAMP program, which had all the promise of saving homeowners, and it largely did not. And I have to curtail what I say because I was an advocate during that era, and it was a very emotional time seeing all of these Black and brown homeowners losing their homes. And now I'm reminded of even today, my law center is looking at creating a program that helps middle class Black homeowners, because if you own a home, you're not considered poor enough to get access to the resources, even if you may also be falling behind in your mortgage. So there's this perpetual gap that people in the middle class, particularly the working middle class, lower working middle class, are in because they're too wealthy to get the benefits, but too poor to take advantage of the benefits that are intended for them. So this is a perpetual program that I would hope, after reporting like this and after conversations like this continuing in earnest, that our leaders and the government, the decision-making process would be much more nuanced and much more adept at meeting the needs of the people who need it. Jeff, we're almost at the end of our segment today, but I want to ask you, what hope is there for homeowners going forward in Louisiana, either participating in this program or who are still left to attempt to rebuild, trying to reclaim home, community, and family? What is the outlook for what the future of this program or the people who should have benefited from it? What does that look like?
Well, in conversations with some of the architects of the program, David was actually able to get some of them to say that they think that this all should be reopened, and there should be a reexamination of whether people should get more money for the damage they received in compensation for this. I think the question is whether in the current political environment, that's something that really is going to be reopened. But I think it's really telling that the people who really were responsible for setting this up even acknowledged that they thought that after being presented with this evidence, after being presented with this reporting, they said, you know what, this didn't do what we thought it should, and the federal government should fix that.
Yeah. I'm always hopeful until I'm reminded of the political environment in which we currently live. And then I
Yeah.
remember, oh, right. I don't know
Well,
if I should hold on to hope that much. Go ahead, David, final
no,
comment.
I mean, the argument there is going to be that ship has sailed, right? But
Yeah.
Mhm.
one thing that we can take solace in is that the federal government no longer structures programs this way to deal, because hey, we're dealing with more and more of these big natural disasters. We have more of these programs that are going to rely on the Housing and Urban Development Department's
Yep.
funds to rebuild, and they can't make this mistake again. And
Yeah.
they've already acknowledged that, at least. And now the thought is from some of the architects of the program is, hey, we were the guinea pigs. Nobody had a roadmap of
Mm.
anything of this magnitude, and we were breaking out from our usual process of rebuilding to deal with something as large as Katrina, that in Louisiana alone, 300,000 homes were destroyed or damaged.
Wow.
So if you're dealing with something on that level, they had to kind of come up with a new plan, and they made some mistakes, and they're saying, hey, maybe we should acknowledge that we've learned from this and we're better off now for programs going forward. How about helping out the people who had to suffer because of it?
I appreciate that. And hopefully HUD Secretary Marsha Fudge, who we've had on this show, is listening. And I know she is a serious advocate for the working poor. And so I'm hopeful that between the reporting that's covering the story, the article itself, the reports that the article was based on, and just, again, advocates hearing these types of conversations and continuing to elevate the need for support, hopefully we will get a retooling of this formula that is going to meet the needs, because, y'all, climate change is not going anywhere, and we are all going to find ourselves increasingly more likely to require this type of support from government. Jeff and David, it's been a real pleasure having you here. I'm a fan of ProPublica. Y'all do great work, so I appreciate your spending some time with us today to help explain this program.